Let's look at a 16th century German rapier, or is it a broadsword? Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria. So I'm here at Olympia Auction looking at some of the amazing lots in the upcoming sale on the 4th of December 2024. Now this sword caught my eye because, well, frankly, it's beautiful. It's an absolutely gorgeous piece and it's in fantastic condition. Given that this dates to about 1580 to 1590, I mean, incredible, right? Absolutely amazing condition. Beautifully made. I mean, look at those fullers, double fullers. Look at the detailing on that ricasso. I mean, it's just an absolutely gorgeous sword, right? But what is it? Is it a rapier? Well, it's a relatively narrow blade, right? We'll come back to that in a second. It's 42 inches long. Now, when you first look at this, you kind of think, okay, is this one of those sort of military rapiers? So it's a sword with a rapier length blade. It's a relatively narrow blade. It's a form of swept hilt. We'll come back to the hilt in a second. But notice that it keeps its width or breadth all the way up to the tip. And the tip is fairly flat and fairly broad. So we have a look at it here. So you can see it's not particularly acutely pointed. It's also not a particularly stiff blade. Okay, so it's got a fair amount of flex to it. So in terms of the distal taper and the shape of the tip of the blade, what we're actually looking at here is something which is really more akin to a narrow broadsword than a cutting rapier, at least in my point of view. Now, the term rapier is obviously very problematic, and depending on how you define a rapier, you may or may not agree that this is a rapier. Now, if we look at Joseph Swetnam's treatise of 1617, so he's writing in English, only 20 years later than this sword is, he uses the term rapier or long sword. So it's very clear that to Swetnam, at least, writing only a couple of decades after this sword was made, he regards a rapier as not quite the same thing as a long sword. And I suspect that this is what Swetnam would have termed a long sword. The difference between the two being that a rapier is more catered towards thrusting, more nimble at the tip, probably for the most part a little bit stiffer. So it's really more of a thrust-centric sword, whereas this sword, while obviously it can thrust, it's a pointed piece of metal, it is predominantly a cutting sword. Now, at that point, to support my argument, I would also come up to look at the hilt. So the form of this hilt is really more akin to earlier side swords, as we'd sometimes call them. Now, side sword is a modern curatorial term, it's not historical, but it does differentiate between the sorts of swords that we see in things like Marozzo, Manciolino, Dall'Agocchi, Vigiani, that are used more for cutting, or at least used a lot for cutting, and not only for thrusting, or not predominantly for thrusting, as we would see in Agrippa and Capoferro and these sorts of people, Fabrice onwards. So, in my opinion, what this is essentially a really big side sword, or a military sword, we could call it a form of broadsword. Now, adding to that, two extra factors. Firstly, it has a thumb ring. Now, not to say that you can't put a thumb ring on a rapier. You can, and we do find it sometimes on swords which are unquestionably rapiers, you do sometimes find thumb rings. But that being the case, while we can also put the finger over the front quillon and through the finger ring, and the two things can touch together, that does introduce a grip which is somewhat similar to that found in Girard Thibault's what most people would describe as a rapier treatise of the 1620s, if I remember correctly. So theoretically, we could have a rapier with this kind of hilt, but it is nevertheless a fairly simple hilt. We only have two rings on the outside, we have a thumb ring on the inside, and we don't have any, we've got large, heavy quillons. This is a type of hilt which, while you can find it on a rapier, is often found on cut and thrust military swords and side swords. But here's something that might surprise you. So that's a 42-inch blade. And when I picked this sword up, I expected it to be lighter and more nimble than it is. But I'll tell you, a lot of what a sword is defined by how it handles and how it moves. And this moves like a basket-hilted broadsword. It moves like a backsword. It doesn't move like a rapier. Its rotational points are such that it feels like a cutting sword. So when you pick this up, regardless of what it looks like, regardless of its hilt features or the breadth of its blade, it feels like a side sword or a broadsword or a backsword. It doesn't feel like a rapier. So to me, this is a broadsword, not a rapier. But here's the thing which might surprise you. I weighed this, and this weighs 1,680 grams, 1,680 grams. That is a heavy sword. So not to say that rapiers can't be heavy, and some rapiers are heavy, some rapiers are light. Rapiers can be as light as 800 grams, they can be as heavy as 1,800 grams. They vary hugely. But this sword, when you combine all of the features together, when you combine the breadth of the blade near the tip, the fact that it's got a fairly spatulate tip and very thin, it's got a lot of distal taper, the fact that it rotates and feels in the hand like a sword which really is designed for cutting with, as well as thrusting, but certainly not specialized for the thrust. The fact that it's got a fairly open hilt with a thumb ring, but the fact that it weighs 1,680 grams. This is a big military broadsword that could equally be used on horseback or on foot. And I personally would not classify this as a rapier. Moreover, I don't think Joseph Swetnam in 1617 would have classified this as a rapier. This is a long sword, as he would call it. Not a long sword, but a long sword. AKA, if you want to call it that, we could possibly call it a military rapier. We could possibly just call it a broadsword. Anyway, what do you think this is? What would you have thought it? Were you surprised by the fact that this is 1,680 grams? That is a heavy, big sword, but it's an absolutely gorgeous piece, and I hope you've enjoyed seeing it. Anyway, thanks a lot for watching, and I hope to see you again soon. Cheers, folks. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.